Yeah, I'm Gerard Postiglione, and I'm in the Faculty of Education at the University of Hong Kong. I'm Gerard Postiglione, and I'm in the Faculty of Education at the University of Hong Kong. Today, this is a special seminar sponsored by the Consortium for Research on Higher Education in Asia of the Faculty of Education. And I'm probably going to give a bit of a long introduction here, so, but I think it's appropriate. I want to introduce first the speaker today. Professor Brian Wong is a member of the Philosophy Department of the University of Hong Kong, one of our colleagues. And I wrestled him to come over to the Faculty of Education because he gives keynotes in different top-tier universities around the world, and he touches on educational issues. So I needed to get him in here. Unfortunately, it's after June, so many people are on holiday already. But we are here, and we're recording this, and this will be on YouTube, and people will learn about it. Now, let me say a little bit about Brian. It's very clear that he is a political theorist and a geopolitical strategist. He examines what? He examines authoritarian regimes and citizens' political and moral responsibilities, including colonial and historical injustices and the interaction between domestic politics and foreign policy of states in East Asia. And he discusses these issues with some of the most important foreign policy specialists in Asia. Now, his credentials, okay? He only has a couple of master's degrees from Oxford, both with distinction and first-class honors. One from Wolfson College in Oxford, and the other one from Pembroke. His doctorate is from Balliol College of Oxford University, and his doctorate is in the field of, you guessed it, politics. And so his talk today, of course, will reflect that. Now, there's a little bit more of the introduction, which I think is very important for scholars in our faculty, like Professor Cheng, who's often in the media, writes regularly for the Economic Times, and I read his work. He's published actually a book, a collection of his readings. And that's kind of how I learned about Professor Brian Wong, because he also wrote regularly for the Hong Kong Economic Times and other publications, like what, ladies and gentlemen? Time Magazine, Foreign Policy, the Financial Times, Diplomat, Fortune, the SCMP, of course, Nikkei in Japan, the Japan Times, the US Law Institute, and the Hindu, which is the top newspaper in India, those of you who follow India. Now, I also should say that he has contributed to publications like The Atlantic. I don't know if you know The Atlantic. It's a US publication, as well as Nico and Politico. So he's out there in the world, and he's talking to people, and he's advising think tanks. For example, the Carter Center, that's Jimmy Carter, former president. His center has a US-China perception monitor, and the UK National Committee on China, which is probably pretty busy these days. I could say much more, but I won't. Brian has taught at modules at Stanford and Harvard and Carnegie, Tsinghua University, Tufts, and also for the discussant today, who I've already introduced, but Professor Cheng Kaiming is a colleague of us, well known in Hong Kong. I always see him as really, when people think of Hong Kong education around the world, he's the name that comes up first. And the reason I mention this, Kaiming, is because Brian, you might know, coached the debating program at Eton College for 4 years. So when you comment, be careful. He's a good debater, for sure. As I say, it's a pleasure to have Brian here today with us. And I just want to tell you the title. Now, you've probably read the title. It's a very interesting title. And for someone like me, who had most of my education in the United States and has I'm a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, so this topic for me is very important. Academic exchanges and Sino-American relations. And remember that there was a time, I don't know if it's still true, that most of the doctorates of the academic staff at the University of Hong Kong, which were formerly from UK, started to move over to the US. So that's important. Now he's got, this is the final part of the introduction, he's got 3 subtitles. Canary in the coal mine, meaning that a canary can tell if there's trouble from breathing the air in there. A bellwether of change. Or finally, A Bridge Over Troubled Waters, which is a title of a paper I asked Brian to critique of mine, and he critiqued it very well. I made quite a few changes, and I have acknowledged you in that paper. So thank you very much. But I don't know if it's the canary, the bell, or the troubled water. So without further ado, Brian, thank you for coming today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you once again to Professor Cheng Kaiming for being a wonderful friend, mentor, and discussant. Truly an honor and privilege. And thank you to many in the audience today, to many of you who are enriching our conversation, including those of you joining us online. I don't know how many you are, but rest assured, strength doesn't come from numbers, but the lack thereof. So that's useful food for thought. I want to begin my paper today with a bunch of statistics and facts, and then delve into exploring and unpacking the sort of 3 metaphors I outlined at the top of the paper. And I'd also want to bring in floor voices, and also consult my learned friends here in a room to bounce ideas off you, really, to try and figure out, it's not an easy situation we're faced with, but how can we accurately interpret, make sense of, and respond to the current state of Sino-American exchanges, or the lack thereof, between China and America. The first number, or stat I'll begin with, is 15,000 to 300. 15,000 was the number of US students studying in mainland China between 2011 and 2012, and 300 is a number, the lowest nadirs that were reached during the COVID-19 pandemic. Over 1/2 of these 300 students or so, I've been reliably informed, were in the Yenqing and Schwarzman programs, which meant that they were all studying in either PKU or Tsinghua. That's concerning. Not the fact that they were studying in PKU or Tsinghua, but the fact that there were only 300 with such an opportunity and also the privilege to do so. The second number that's less concerning, at least on surface, although equally so when we think about the fundamentals here, is 370,000 to 290,000, which is a number of students from China studying in the US between 2019 and 2024. There was a rapid decrease of, according to my inaccurate mathematical assessments, more than 20%, in a number of students from the mainland enrolled in the US. Finally, 42% of Americans see China as an enemy of the US, as per the most recent Pew Research poll. And that's up from only 25%, I say only, but it's still concerning and alarming in its own right, 2 years ago. More reassuringly, though, in April 2022, over 80% of Chinese respondents said they view the US as an enemy, and that statistic dropped to less than 50% by October 2023. So what's reassuring isn't the absolute numbers, but the relative trends and trajectories, so to speak, here. Now, of course, we should take these polling results with a healthy, pinch of salt or two, and not let them trap ourselves in believing in self-fulfilling narratives and prophecies. But what these numbers certainly show is that Sino-American education exchange, it's in trouble. It's undergoing at the very least a rough patch, if not indeed is in secular and arguably irreversible decline. But of course, as a scholar, I can't just conclude, abruptly that in favor of one conclusion or the other. Otherwise, it would make me a politician. So in short, the questions I want to ask with this paper is threefold. First, what do the numbers above tell us about the state of Sino-American education exchanges? Secondly, what do these numbers tell us about the state of bilateral interactions and dynamics between the US and China? And thirdly, what, if at all, is the causality between these two distinct concepts? And that always is the most challenging question of all, causality, and unpacking, what caused what or didn't cause what, which is equally important from a point of view of positive, negative A/B testing. But I digress. So finally, the key thesis I'd like to present with my paper today is that Sino-American education exchanges are remarkable in their ability to both reflect the present state and shape as well as the future trajectory in a path-dependent and also latent manner, the future or the status of bilateral relations between China and the US. And yet the agency and the modicum of freedom that they possess is limited and determined by, and could even be overridden by, political calculations and maneuvers on both sides of the Pacific. So in short, to answer the question as predictably as one could possibly be expected to be, I'm going to predictably say, it's all three. Sino-American education exchanges are a canary in a coal mine, are a bellwether of change, and are hopefully a bridge over troubled waters, so to speak. So on that very note, I want to move on to just setting out the scene and to offer some historical background to this very paper. Because as much as the present matters, it is incomplete without an understanding and grappling with the past, so to speak. And here I refer everyone to William Kirby's excellent book, Empires of Ideas, Can China, and in brackets, and Hong Kong, Lead the World of Universities in the 21st Century. I think it's a fantastic book on which he also gave a talk at the CCCW last year, which is a centre founded and convened by Professor Li Cheng. I also recommend Teresa Beavis's International Students in American Colleges and Universities, a history on which I based a lot of my following introductory background information, and I really want to thank her for the exhaustive and comprehensive exposition and also the archival work that she undertook there. Essentially, what's worth highlighting when it comes to historical developments in the 20th century are a couple of points, and a couple of key points I want to highlight in general. The first is a difference in modus operandi between China, or what had constituted China back then, as disparate countries and nations within the same country and factions within the same country on one hand, and the West specifically and chiefly America on the other hand when it came to education engagement. Whilst China's primary MO was largely about supplying and sending students abroad in the earlier phases and also the later phases of the 20th century, and in between roping in a lot of foreign academics for very designated specific tasks, especially to do with technology, that was the Chinese MO, so to speak, right? So by technology, I'm talking about nuclear technology, sensitive technologies that today we see a rapid decoupling and also a severance in ties between China and the US, whereas back then, China was very aggressive in roping, and even at a height and a peak of Sino-American tensions during the first periods, the first few decades, or first 2 decades of the Cold War, there was nevertheless an active attempt to court and also bring in foreign academics. Whereas on the other hand, when it came to the US, I'd say the American MO was really more about pushing forward more joint initiatives and projects like, for instance, in Shangpan, in Hunan, in Changsha, the collaboration between Yale and China, which I'll talk about shortly, alternatively in opening up scholarship and also enrollment opportunities for Chinese students. And indeed, Wong was in a Yale class 1854 and the first Chinese to have graduated from an American degree offering higher education institution, hailing from Guangdong, of which we are a part, or I guess adjacent to, depending on whom you ask. Guangdong is one of the most West exposed and internationalized parts of China. It had always been, the place where East genuinely met West, albeit in less fortuitous circumstances than today in Hong Kong. We're talking about, of course, the Koxinga, and also the roster of colonialist comprador institutions and the Shisanhang in Guangdong, but that's their side. What we need to emphasize or realize here, though, is that there was a good reason, actually, that many of those in the first batch of scholars that the Qing dynasty sent out had largely to do with the Cantonese culture and also Guangdong as a province, and that's because of probably the presence of a heterogeneous mixture of cultures, languages, traders, and folks from different nationalities and origins in Guangdong ever since the end of the Ming dynasty, so to speak, and even at the height of the Haijin, which is a C-band introduced during the later era or the later periods of the Ming dynasty. And finally then, what we should recognize here was people like Wing, or folks like Wing, amongst the first batch of students abroad, convinced the Qing government to set up the Chinese educational mission in 1871. And that program commenced then in 1872, but stopped abruptly after 9 years. That had largely to do with a multitude or tapestry of factors. Some said it was to do with the fears and concerns by conservatives within the Qing dynasty and the court about ideological and moral contamination, about the fact that, quote unquote, these Chinese students were imitating the Americans, playing more than they studied. They even adopt some of the American ways in their actions. That was apparently not an ideal way of approaching education. Now, each to their own, I suppose, but at least from their eyes and lenses, that was something to be concerned about, that is Qing dynasty officials. Others would posit that, because of the ability on the part of the Chinese students to assimilate and find, entry ports and ways of connecting with the education institutions in which they enrolled, there was a fear on the part of the Qing leaders that they would experience brain drain as a result of this trend of folks studying overseas. And still a third interpretation was that quite simply they ran out of funding and the Qing dynasty was uninterested in backing a vanity project of the reformers, which by the end of the 19th century had very quickly fallen out of favour. So it really depends on whom you ask, and I'm just laying these interpretations out there. One thing that's worth noting though before we proceed is that quite eerily so, many of these discourses, the fears of Western contamination, fears of ideological dilution, the concerns to do with, spending money on unproductive subjects, these are discourses that we can still see today in both China and the US when it comes to studying abroad. So, some say history rhymes, I would say history minds. So, on that very note, we can then move on to more history. The Yale-China Association was founded in 1901. First incorporated as a Yale Foreign Missionary Society, and I was alerted to this piece of information by rather recently when I was visiting the Yale Beijing Center just last week in Beijing, and I was really impressed by the amazing work that Carol Lee is doing up there with all the visits and exchanges and talks that we're hosting. He even hosted Stephen Roach of banking fame rather recently when he gave a speech there. And it goes to show that Yale remains a very powerful vehicle for track-to and subnational or people-to-people diplomacy, even as US-China tensions rage on today. And yet, going back to the history, the founders of this association chose China as the key site of focus for their work, largely because of their interest in this vast civilizational power, but also more imminently due to the death of a Yale graduate, Horace Tracy Pitkin, at the hands of the boxers in the Boxer Rebellion. And indeed, the YCA then subsequently founded the Yali School and the Xiangyang Medical College, and Mao Zedong in fact edited the publication, the student magazine, and ran a bookshop out of Xiangyang College. So that's interesting trivia. The indemnity scholarships that were offered and granted after the Boxer Rebellion, almost amounting to $12 billion in gold, were offered in the form of scholarships to Chinese students to provide them with the opportunities to enroll in US institutions. And here it's worth noting that American soft power really showed through in this episode in its ability to influence and shape and mold the hearts and minds of individuals who enrolled in institutions abroad. In lieu of requiring mandatory reparations and demanding that China apologize for the actions of what they termed to be the impetuous and insolent Boxers in a rebellion, what the Americans instead did is they said, why don't you come over and study in our institutions? And here the insight I would highlight for all countries, not just China and the US, is that perhaps the best means of building up soft power and influence abroad is to open up one's gates, even if it's unilateral, even if it's asymmetrical, by drawing more students in, CF, the Swartzman scholarships, CF, these other engagement programs. China could go a long way in bolstering the understanding of itself without necessarily resorting to hard-baked propaganda or narratives and messaging that falls flat on deaf ears, so to speak. So I'm going to expedite, I'm going to speed up the rest of this section because I don't want to spend most of my talk talking about history, but I will just flag that subsequent to the Cultural Revolution, of course there was a hiatus between the 1920s and 1970s or so in terms of large-scale student exchanges, largely due to the internal domestic political strife, the invasion, the occupation of China and Manchuria specifically by the Japanese, and then the Civil War, and of course, the first 20 years of the PRC were really not known for their international openness, even though, of course, China remained friends with many in Africa, the Caribbean, and also in Southeast Asia, but that's an aside. But in short, after the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping said, to send students abroad to study is also a concrete step in modernization. He said it in Chinese, but I just translated it. So it's worth noting that whether it be the rehabilitation of Western-educated liberals and progressives within the system, or the opening up of quotas and visas for students from China to study abroad, or just a rhetorical empowerment, right? An encouragement of Chinese folks to go out there to all of these were signs of China's adopting a distinctly divergent and more liberatory approach and more permissive approach to Sino-American education exchanges from the mid-1970s onwards, and indeed many of my friends were beneficiaries, prime beneficiaries from that period of opening up and reform under Deng Xiaoping. And here's a funny anecdote. President Jimmy Carter apparently received a 3 a.m. call from an advisor in China relaying a request from Deng Xiaoping one day to send 5,000 students to America. And a groggy Jimmy Carter snapped before hanging up the phone with the following: "Tell them to send 100,000. Okay, that's not a good Jimmy Carter impression. I tried with my Jimmy Carter accent, but it really is quite exceptional. And this came from Eric Fisher's excellent article on the China project, by the way, so I must credit him in terms of the source of the information. So as it goes to show, times have changed, or times had changed by the beginning of opening up and reform, and there was genuinely curiosity, dynamism, willingness to have more Chinese students exposed to the previously lambasted Western ideals, liberal cultures, and the progressivism of the West. And of course, the rest is history since then. Now, before we turn to the present, I just want to open up the floor to 2 polls from me. The first is, to what extent do you think China has benefited more from Sino-American education exchange over the past 50 years than America, or vice versa? Or maybe equally? So I know equally is a tempting answer, but in all honesty, who thinks China has benefited more?
China.
Okay.
US.
Raise your hand if you think China has benefited more. Okay, that's 1. 2. Okay, and US? 2.
Financially or intellectually?
See, this is the hallmark of a brilliant academic. Wonderful. And Kaiming, would you agree? Jerry? Do you think China or the US has benefited more?
Both.
Both.
I don't think we compare
Right.
which one. If we look at US, over the years, the higher education is very much due to scholars who came from other countries. So that's been that's why the higher education in America is so strong. But of course, China benefits.
And obviously, Professor Ming was an incredible scholar, but also administrator as well, who had to deal with some of the most thorniest of moments and crises from the perspective of any academic leader. But he managed it so deftly and with such integrity that I think he really is an exemplar of how you could be a politician and also an academic administrator at the same time. But as long as you put students first, that's what it matters. And that's what matters the most. But anyway, I digress.
Can I put in an advertisement for Brill Press will publish Professor Minwei Fang's
Did you edit it, Gerard?
description, no, of how, because he introduced the economics of education into China. So that's a pretty big thing.
Wonderful.
Further digression. Yes, I know Bing Wei Fang when he was in Escondido in Stanford University.
Wow.
And then we joined the same World Bank project to Guizhou and Shanxi. He is really very thoughtful person. He told me all his dilemmas, where to come back or not, how to handle the disturbances in China and so forth. But he made up his mind, and became the most, almost the golden age of Peking University.
One of the most loved, if not the most loved, Shuji of Beida and also a leader of Beida. Now, on that very note, history is brilliant and the present is also urgent. So I will tie the 2 together by asking the opening question: Bellwether of change, Canary in a coal mine, or bridge over troubled waters? Well, all 3 of them. So the following comprises sort of the triple characteristic, the sort of trilemma, not even trilemma, but the tensions and the state of confusion that undergirds the present state of Sino-American education dynamic, so to speak. The first dimension is the bellwether of change. And it's worth noting that the term bellwether stems from Middle English, Billy Video, which denoted a particular practice of placing a bell around the neck of the lead wether, the male sheep, and a shepherd would then note the movements of the animals by hearing the bell, even when the flock was not in sight, okay? So you could gather where the flock is without seeing it. It's a bit like echolocation. And out of sight, but certainly not out of mind. And the reason why I chose this for the first prompt here is because I think there's a certain element to education exchange that is really quite useful as serving as writing on a wall, such that even when we can't see the actual phenomena, we can predict what the phenomena that are most likely to follow would therefore look like. It's almost like a weather forecast, so to speak, and that's why we say, there's certain states that are bellwether states in American elections as another application of this. And within this, my thesis is higher education exchanges are useful indicators of the underlying inter-bureaucratic politics and overarching shifts in policy elite sentiments in both the US and China, given that their constituents are usually perceived to be, and if not are in fact largely likelier to be, more vulnerable and susceptible to political capture, influence or manipulation. So in short, there's a high degree of susceptibility and also fluidity, and that is why, when it comes to changes that are due to come, one would benefit from, and one could do worse than looking at how higher education exchanges in terms of numbers, equality and dynamics, and also other aspects of it are in fact faring, so to speak. And plus, it's worth noting that foreign students lack legal representation and access in the US because of the inability to navigate a complex and Byzantine legal and judicial system. And the same could of course be said for foreign students, especially from countries that are not necessarily politically prioritized in the mainland when it comes to navigating the Byzantine immigration visa movement and, dare we say, quarantine laws as well over recent years. So in short, this to me is a demonstration of that affirms what I said about the bellwether nature of HE exchanges. But of course you might ask, okay, so what exactly are the present exchanges bellwethers of, right? What are the trends that we are seeing from the interactions between the two sides? And I would say there are broadly two trends I would like to highlight. The first is the growing soft power competition between China and the US, and the second is the increasing securitization of the relationship at large. And both of these are trends that are reflected in and also impact on domains beyond the educational and also tertiary institutions. So I'll start first with soft power competition. What's unique about soft power, since it was coined by Joseph Nye as a term, around 2 to 3 decades ago, I suppose. Joseph's been around for a very long while, is essentially that it emphasizes the intangible, the unquantifiable, and the perception-oriented objectives and also prerogatives adopted by countries in advancing their standing internationally, but also for individuals within countries to enhance and bolster other people's recognition and understanding of their own peoples and communities. So that to me is a sort of application of soft power, and why it's germane to not just higher education, but also the cultural, also the musical, also the historical, and all of these other aspects of a country's overarching strategic position that don't touch upon military power or don't turn exclusively upon technological and economic prowess, despite the existence of some degree of interconnectivities between all of them. The US has long employed higher education initiatives as a means of bolstering its soft power, not just through the Indemnity Scholarship Program, which is very, very smart, but also the Fulbright Program, established in 1946. Marshall scholarships, funding their own students to go abroad, and also the Rhodes Scholarship, although a funny joke that has often been told to me is that, some of my non-American Rhodes friends have complained to me or suggested to me that actually the Rhodes Scholarship has destroyed American soft power by sending these particular scholars abroad. But I say to them, that's really mean, let's not go there, okay? So these scholars could also be great scholars, and the broader point we can infer from this is that America does not hesitate in drawing upon higher education as a resource, as a strategic resource to the country. Whereas when it comes to China doing the same, I would say this is a more recent phenomenon for China to reciprocate and to do the same thing via setting up the Confucius Institutes. In 2004, that was when the first CI was established, and then subsequently in the early 2010s, through extensive back and forth conversations and also with the open invitation from Steve Schwarzman, they established a Schwarzman program, which was then followed by the Yingqing program, because Beidar said we also want one too. So, we therefore have 2 excellent top-notch scholarships and also exchange programs on offer in Beijing and in leading Chinese institutions. But the fact that both of these powers saw value and importance in HE exchanges, that to me is a pretty recent phenomenon that really began at the turn of the millennium, when China, upon having joined the WTO, felt much more confident as a power, much more assured in terms of its economic prospects, and therefore also started thinking about how it appeared to the world beyond. CF, the narratives that it promulgated in the run-up to the 2008 Olympic, CF, the portrayal of the China model as a model of success, vis-a-vis the American way of life during the 2008 and 2009 GFC, and of course the global financial crisis, that is, and of course the subsequent sort of dissemination of Chinese cultural documentaries, information and knowledge by Confucius Institutes. I mean, to me, the new delta here isn't so much America, engaging in soft power diplomacy, but China leveraging HE, higher education, as a means of spreading soft power. And of course, both Washington and Beijing see higher education now as a part, an important, but a part nonetheless, of greater, wider trends of great power diplomacy to establish their overseas cultural and symbolic and rhetorical presence at large. And that is why, to me, looking at higher education trends is instrumental in informing us as observers of the strategies adopted by national leaderships, because it suggests and goes to show that China is more than just a hard power nation or an economic power fixated nation, so to speak. The second item, of which higher education exchanges are a bellwether, concerns increasing securitization. And this has a lot to do with the fear and the proclaimed fears on both sides. I must emphasize both sides of the Pacific of so-called foreign interference and transformation. And it is true, allow me to begin by saying that higher education has indeed in the past been used by both sides as means of conveniently accomplishing, nefarious strategic objectives, insidious objectives through espionage, counter-espionage, and this is demonstrated by the series of convictions, arrests and detentions in both China and the US of the other side's spies, masquerading as higher education workers. And this is a valid concern. I don't want to dismiss this, and I certainly don't want to come across as Pollyannish and thinking that we live in a world where no spies exist. Even though if they did, you wouldn't know if one were one. So that's something to think about, food for thought there. But interestingly, what I would also highlight here is that academia and education exchanges are easily targeted as sites where the fear or the risk of potential interference and infiltration is blown out of proportion, and where over-securitization occurs. Okay, and this is for two reasons. The first has to do with why security agencies tend to indeed look at higher education as a useful conduit, and the second has more to do with inter-bureaucratic politics. The former maps onto the fact that ultimately it's much easier for students to apply for, or for folks to apply for prospective students and academic visas and short-term exchange visas than for permanent work visas and residencies. And it's just much easier to brand and frame one's work as an academic initiative than, say, a business consultancy gig or a political consultancy gig, which tends to draw the ire and attract more eyeballs and scrutiny than academic exchange. So that is indeed, there is some merit in the view that academic exchanges are tools and vehicles for securitization, interference, espionage, and so forth. It is indeed happening, and it's a valid observation. I'm not saying it's a valid trend, I'm saying it's an observation of a trend. And yet, on the other hand, my hypothesis is that the intelligence and counterintelligence departments across both countries believe that students make for pretty easy picks, and also academics by extension as well, because they by and large lack the kind of economic wherewithal, the political exposure and networks that many more seasoned operatives might have using other covers, so to speak, but also that even if there were indeed false positives, so they identified folks that should be held liable for purported espionage, the legal recourse available to these individuals is incredibly limited. Take the MIT professor Cheng, who was unjustly targeted, I hope you'd all agree, unjustly targeted by the China Initiative for the purported undisclosed funding that he took from Chinese institutions. I believe Professor Cheng, as of last year at the very least, was still fighting a case against the DOJ concerning the harassment and also the arranging that he experienced at their hands. And yet, when not this case would in fact go through with compensation to be handed out to him, remains as of today to be seen, and furthermore, in general speaks to the amount of hurdles that even someone as seasoned and established as Professor Cheng at MIT, with I believe tenure and also rich endowments of resources, had to face questions concerning his political allegiance. It's farcical, but it's also a tragic indictment of the times we're in, that this is such a heavily politicized and politically charged environment. The same has applied, of course, to the targeting of Western academics in China or the mainland, although I must say, from my own qualitative research, I found far fewer cases of actual bona fide academics in the mainland being harassed and searched and interrogated at the customs and borders as compared with, and this is certainly anecdotal evidence, but again, I know of several prominent Chinese scholars who had to be, were stopped and interrogated and asked about their intentions when they were leading delegations on academic exchanges with think tanks, with US think tanks, so to speak. So in short, there's some kind of asymmetry, but I don't think there's enough evidence for me to establish that as an authoritative claim in terms of the treatment of academics and scholars by both sides of the ocean. And finally, there's more general securitization across the board, and this is indeed what the Bellwether is a bellwether for, right? So around 10 years back, we saw a slew of high-profile arrests and trials of cases of espionage and spies from both sides. And now 10 years on, we're looking at a state of Sino-American relations where not just higher education, but also other forms of people-to-people exchanges, sports exchanges, cultural exchanges, food sales. Apparently food, like potato spuds and garlic, could also be national security threats in the eyes of the American bureaucratic agency. So that's quite interesting. I wonder if that's because many in America are vampires. But maybe not. That's just a terrible joke. Draculas don't like America. There's too much pizza in America. Dracula likes blood. So anyway, that's right. Yeah, it's the Italian in you. He's got some Italian in him. So the final point to note here is securitization has now manifested through border searches and also interrogation on the U.S. borders. Exit bans being imposed upon individuals in the mainland, on individuals suspected to have had affiliation with criminal elements. So you don't have to be a suspect. You don't even have to be potentially involved in a crime. You just need to know someone for your information to be useful, for an exit ban to potentially be slapped onto you in the mainland. Now, fortunately, exit bans have yet to be imposed, as far as I'm aware, on university students studying abroad or studying in the mainland. But on many other folks, any other kinds of occupations, many other kinds of categories of labor of foreign expats in the mainland, exit bans are indeed seen as a pretty real threat. That is deterring folks from going to the mainland as well. I'm not besmirching what's going on there. I'm not besmirching China, I'm just telling the truth, which is that exit bans exist. Whether or not they are appropriately enforced, that's of course not a question. But it's worth noting, as of now, there's no evidence to suggest that academics are in fact more likely than non-academics to be spies. But it is nevertheless much easier for them to be targeted, and academics, young researchers, students alike, by the relevant security and counter-espionage agencies as compared with non-academic occupations. And that's something that we've seen over the past 20 years or so. So that is my first point, or the first dimension of this three-faced metaphor. And I will now move on to the second metaphor, and after which I'd like to take some questions and also floor interventions as well. And my second dimensional point to make here concerns a canary in a coal mine. Now, canaries were largely used to detect the presence of carbon monoxide in coal mines, actually, because the bird's rapid breeding rate, the small size, and high metabolic rates rendered the bird, or rendered these canaries, ideal detectors of poisoning. And they are the first ones to die, okay, before the miners, right? And that's before Margaret Thatcher dissolved all the unions in the north of UK as well, the miners, even before that, right? So in short, canaries are helpful, they are easily visualizable, and they're inherent warnings, but they're also, fundamentally something that's beautiful, nevertheless destroyed, and severely, corrupted, denatured, if not destroyed altogether, by the harm that is portended by, their wailing for help and their cries for help. So in short, I see canaries in a coal mine as different from the bellwether of Cheng, for the simple reason that when it comes to the bellwether, you can't really see what's going on, you only hear about it and infer, whereas when it comes to the canaries, they are victims. They are actual victims that are distinctly organic in their original forms, ideal and positive and useful and constructive, nevertheless stymied by the destructive forces, inherent in the relationship. So that is my explanation and interpretation of the metaphor, lest I be accused of repeating myself in the next section. Canaries in the coal mine are not the same thing as bellwethers, even though they do have some overlap in their metaphorical functions. And I've got to go into the metaphor here because that is a part of the paper. So, recently, we've seen the expulsion of Chinese students from from a number of universities, with customs agents in American airports barring entry to at least 20 students and scholars with valid visas over the past 3 to 4 months. I believe a PhD student in biomed imaging had a student cancer cancelled. Student visa, not cancelled. No, student visa, not student cancer. Student visa cancelled. And he was forced to buy a $1,400 one-way ticket back to Beijing. And this was something that was covered in Sheridan Prasso's Bloomberg piece on May 29, 2024. Now, it's impossible to establish on my part that all of these individuals were in fact innocent, and I'm not certain that they are. But it's worth noting that it's somewhat implausible to believe that all of them were in fact guilty, given the anecdotal information that was supplied by these individuals, given a first-hand and second-hand accounts that were offered concerning their work and also their student status, and finally, in light of the dearth of transparency and accountability on a part of the customs officials, in a US airport, so to speak. And Chinese officials have also been harassed and interrogated at the US border, on overseas trips. I'm not suggesting here that the same can't be said of the experiences of American students in Beijing or Shanghai, and maybe there indeed has been cases of, or have been cases of, say, tailing, surveillance, monitoring. That is certainly a possibility. Although in terms of concrete reports of that, it's less than clear to me, what the material evidence is, but I welcome your inputs and also your feedback, especially those of you studying the treatment of American students in China, if this is a persisting problem, an issue as well. But long story short, my thesis on the second point is that higher education exchanges are victims, in many ways, in cases, victims of growing geopoliticization and weaponization by both sides of the Pacific. Individuals find themselves squeezed and compelled to either choose sides or vacate particular sensitive fields altogether if they were to stay in the other country, so to speak. That is my thesis. And there are two parts to my explanation, or my hypothesis concerning why this is happening. The first part revolves around inter-bureaucratic competition, and the second revolves around, essentially a sort of rational choice theory, and how individual students and scholars therefore react per the RCT framework. So step one, concerning inter-bureau competition and politics. It's worth noting that when it comes to the CPB, the FBI, the CIA, and the DSS, these are all departments with different remits, different prerogatives, and different boundaries and delineation of boundaries to power. And yet they are all in practice in possession of some stakes, some skin, in a game of foreign students' presence, especially suspected espionage being carried out by students in America. And which is to say that if I were an official in charge of one of these departments and I'm seeking to justify my budget, my paycheck, my power, my ability to influence and control domestic agenda, I would want to hype up A, the fact that there's a China security threat so I can get paid more at large, and B, that I'm the one catching more spies than the other. It's a bit like the sort of yundong that you saw in mainland China, during the Cultural Revolution with the Great Leap Forward, right? Where everyone and all was assigned a quota. You've got to grow this amount of crops. If you can't grow that many crops, then you better reduce the number of mouths required to be fed by these crops and so forth. But in short, it's almost this sort of overzealous fixation upon rivalry and competition between these departments, in my view, that is driving this growing securitization. And the same could also be said of what's going on in the mainland as well. And there are relevant agencies that are again jostling for power by emphasizing and doubling down on security threat, quote unquote, posed by students. Not saying that the threat doesn't exist, not saying these concerns aren't legitimate, but that they are overblown. And that is my hypothesis in critique of the trends that we're seeing in both China and the US today. So the second question then is, what does that mean in terms of folks who want to study abroad, who want to go or are interested in studying abroad in particular fields? Well, my prediction is quite simple. They are less inclined to go because of the risk to their careers, risk to their freedoms, risk to their economic health and well-being, and ultimately there are better options out there. That's why we're seeing, trivially, and I know this from some statistics I saw recently, many more mainland Chinese students applying for A, the UK, B, Singapore, and C, as a part of China, but as a different part of China, Hong Kong. So we are beneficiaries of some sorts from the geopolitical escalation. And similarly, judging from the earlier numbers concerning American students no longer going to China, or far fewer going to China, it strikes me that the concerns are also weighing down on their minds as well across the pond in the States. And of course, I'd love to bring in a former American student to comment on this in around 2 minutes' time. Okay, so 2 minutes of prep time. But in the meanwhile, I'd highlight that the termination of Fulbright for mainland Chinese, Hong Kong and Macau originating students and scholars, the China Initiative's imposition or introduction under Donald Trump, and basically, despite the nominal suspension, the practical continuation of many of the more disturbing practices of this initiative under Joe Biden, they all speak volumes to the securitization relationship from America and the damaging, detrimental impacts on not just the number of students enrolled from China in the US, but also the understanding of the US and appreciation that there are enduring virtues and merits in the US, and that nationalistic narratives put out by state-sanctioned media shouldn't be the only thing consumed by Chinese students in the mainland. And similarly, the state problem probably is more pernicious and evident when it comes to American students and scholars vis-a-vis China. The fact that only 270 to 300 students were in mainland China, and these are international students, including, but are not limited to, American students only in China during COVID. That speaks volumes about, the kind of destitution of richness of first-hand experiences that many of the predecessors and prior generations, the present generations of China scholars and students in America had enjoyed previously, when it could travel to the mainland and do fieldwork, when it could travel to the countryside, to villages, to listen to and work with leading educators like you yourself as a leading educator, Professor Jerry. The opportunities you had are frankly no longer ones that are taken up or indeed available to American students. And in fact, Peace Corps have yet to be resumed as of today when it comes to just casual, again, youth-to-youth exchanges between China and the US. So the upshot of all of this is that there are clear canaries and clear victims and casualties. One, organic and lively, empirically well-informed scholarship. Two, an appreciation of the other side as human individuals as opposed to as mechanical and robotic subjects and hypothetical objects. And three, scientific and also collaboration in other so-called sensitive subjects. The research on those fronts have largely come to a halt, especially in biotech, nanotech, quantum tech, and also AI. And all of these, to me at the very least, are worrying, because it suggests that when the two greatest powers on planet Earth are unable to work together on issues that are of pressing relevance to the entirety of the world, well, either it is the case that they can find their own ways, or we are really in deep trouble. And I'd like to think, or I'm more inclined to think, it's the latter as opposed to the former, so to speak. And finally, the enrollment of American higher education students in Chinese language courses was already on a decline before COVID-19 due to a mixture of factors. Some say it's to do with the rising attractiveness of other non-Chinese markets. Others would say it has more to do with the growing soft power of Korean and also Japanese cultures and a corresponding increase in interest in Korean and Japanese, right? K-pop, J-pop, Squid Games. What else? There's a girl band from Japan, Blackpink, and that's Korea. There's one called AK-40, no, that's the gun model. AKB-48, there we go, I think that's the Japanese band. I'm so sorry, I'm very bad with pop culture. Working on it though, I wish I had the opportunity to study abroad in Korea. So, on that very note, and this comes from an article, Haim 2024, where it stated that it's dropped by 21% between 2016 and 2020, whilst the enrollment in Korean grew by 25% in the same period. So again, it all the more speaks to the growing soft power and also competitive state of play when it comes to East Asia. And concurrently, though, purely from the lenses of China or understanding of China, this is a rather disconcerting statistic. And all of these trends and canaries in the coal mine feed into the dearth of understanding or the spiral of incomplete and tainted understanding that, dare I say, portends worsening relations and a deterioration in mutual trust and bilateral engagement between China and the US, not just for the next 5 years, but for the next 10 years, 15 years to come. So, I'll stop there and take a short break and see, what folks are feeling in a room here. So I want to just invite folks who haven't spoken just yet. What do you make of, my hypothesis? Do you agree with me that these are canaries that have been slaughtered, or are they going to be phoenixes and, rejuvenate and be revived in the future? And secondly, are HE exchanges good bellwethers, or are they, as with most AI weather models, inaccurate predictors of the weather? And I've used a ChatGPT to tell me the weather. It didn't really work, I guess, because the prompt wasn't specific enough, or more like because it's not supposed to tell me the weather of Hong Kong tomorrow. So in short, what do we think? We're going to open up the floor on these dynamics, so to speak. Courtney?
Good.
Yes? Great, you use my mic. There you go.
I don't like microphones. They're testing. Well, I think that, first of all, thank you so much for sharing that with us. That was an incredible overview. One of the first things that I think my mind kind of draws to as a previous student from the US is whether, in regards to your question about whether this is dead in the water, whether this is a phoenix, whether that change takes place on an interpersonal level, a bureaucratic level, or both. Because again, as a student from my perspective, I think one of the biggest obstacles seeing international students in general on my campus was cultural differences and a willingness to engage over issues that are potentially controversial or problematic.
Yeah.
And so even though those discussions were taking place, a lot of times it took heavy administrative prompting to bring everyone into the same room and really facilitate a conversation on that. And so I think looking at that as, I guess, an avenue to kind of bring the educational exchange back to and like accelerate it to where I think more people would want it to be. I think there is this question of, can education within itself facilitate that, or does it need to be like a broader geopolitical reckoning in order to like lay the framework for that even to be possible? And so from my experience as a student, I do think that there probably would need to be significant pushes on an administrative and governmental level for that to happen, just because even for a lot of the Chinese students who came to study at my university, they were so concerned about their job prospects, being discriminated against, getting a visa, that their willingness to engage in clubs or engage with other students or even to get internships was so limited that like to be in the same rooms, have access to the same activities, that was already so limited that like the odds that I as a US student, like born in the US, would have a lot of opportunities to engage with them, I think was like inherently more limited because we were almost on two different tracks within the same university or within the same program. So we'll stop there. Just initial thoughts.
That's brilliant, and I think what Courtney offered there is a sort of the sociological perspective concerning campus dynamics. We often speak of higher education as if A, we're homogeneous across the board, or B, that we should only look at state vis-a-vis HE sector interactions without necessarily also recognizing that actually what we need to reflect upon too is what goes on campuses. The fact that HKU, and I would like to plug this institution that we're all in a bit more aggressively, which is I think the fact that HKU's managed to retain the internationalist flavors of our education has a lot to do with the fact that international students feel welcome and at ease with the societies, the clubs, the associations, the plethora of things they could do here that make them feel at home. And that is the beauty of HKU's sort of student and campus life, so to speak. But we're not that to say, the same could be said of, say, US universities for Chinese students, but also, and I'm going to talk about this literally now, American students studying in elite Chinese universities, including Beida, Tsinghua. Not everyone could fit in, especially those who can't speak Mandarin. And a friend of mine actually said that he found being able to speak Mandarin a super bonus. By that he meant, sure, you could still survive without speaking Mandarin. It's very friendly, folks are very warm and welcoming to you, but it's different. You're always going to be seen as, wow, you're a foreigner, can we take a photo with you? As opposed to, wow, you're a foreigner who speaks Mandarin, can we take a photo with you? That to him was something that felt very, very different. And he speaks, I would say more than elementary, he speaks pretty good Mandarin actually, and he genuinely felt that because of that he was able to blend in and fit in more with students who would converse in Mandarin. But I guess that's something that, Jerry, you might have had a different experience on when you were there in America.
I was going to ask Courtney, actually, because that was a very interesting analysis of her experience, and that's really what we need, is actual experiences. Yeah. But what I was going to say is, it seems to me, and I'm still studying, and I've studied for 40 years, and you have to keep, but no matter how good you are, you could talk to Daniel Bell about this, no matter how perfect your Mandarin is, and no matter how many years, as soon as you walk in a room, you're 10,000 miles from being Chinese. But so Daniel used to talk about the Tang Dynasty. It was possible during the Tang Dynasty if you could speak Chinese and write Chinese. But anyway, I don't know if you you know, you're in kind of, you see both sides according to Sino. Yeah.
Yes.
Let me, do I need the mic?
Yes.
Applied to use
Oh,
of
yeah, all right.
Online audience. but-
Well, all right, got it. Well, I mean, this is a bit of a part of being, is the curse of critical mass. In the sense that you go abroad and you go abroad with a bunch of people from your own nationality or culture, you're basically not abroad. You're simply abroad in geographical terms, but actually you never left your country. And you know, you see this particularly with groups like Chinese, Pakistanis, Indians, in US or in UK is the same thing. I mean, it's too many of them and it's normal. I mean, culturally they attract and they live in their own community. So this immediately makes them different from all the other international students. And this is important to be said. Because if you're an international student and you don't have anyone culturally, socially close to you, you have the motivation to engage with others. Now, engage with the locals, that's something different, but engaging with the other internationals for sure. Now, this is a very US-China thing. Again, I mean, we're talking about a multipolar world, and you know, interestingly enough, Chinese students are very much welcome elsewhere, like American students. I understand the focus on these two countries for what they represent, but also to say that you know the exchanges, the student exchanges are being kind of the victim here. Yes, the student exchanges between these two countries for sure, for geopolitical reasons and for all the reasons that you've mentioned, but these students are very much welcome elsewhere. So why not take the indirect way? Why not go to other countries and through the other countries influence one another and reopen eventually these exchanges? As a positive way to say, hey, okay, you guys don't want to deal? Okay, that's okay, we go to the other places, we continue to deal with you, like you just said, even unilaterally.
Yeah.
This is not really going unilaterally towards the other country, it's going unilaterally towards the other countries to then impact.
Yeah.
It's a very indirect way. So what do you think about this?
I think that's a brilliant proposal, actually. I think we're already seeing certain countries seize upon that, right? So you look at Canada and also Singapore. You know, these are basically countries where both mainland Chinese and also American, I say mainland Chinese because I do find a Hong Kong student studying abroad is a very different dynamic at play. But mainland Chinese students and you know, American students studying in these campuses, again, in theory, these third-party or neutral states can provide a buffer zone in the spaces in which bridges could be formed and misconceptions addressed. Although my concern there, just to build on your sort of separating or differentiating between being physically abroad and mentally or social culturally abroad distinction there, is that my concern is the sort of formation of echo chambers and also communities of shared ethnic identities is a problem that persists beyond the US for ethnic Chinese students. So take the UK for an example, where many mainland Chinese students, including some good friends of mine, would just hang out with other fellow Chinese students. And that's not because of any fault. I want to say there's no fault, there's no blame, it's just a sort of natural proclivity. Just like, you know, when you go to Oxbridge, you know, all the Etonians sit together and they talk about, well, you know, I would like to go to play polo. And I say, yeah, I want to go watch Marco Polo. There's a difference there, but I suppose each to their own, right? So it's understandable what we call sort of, in sociology, a sort of sortition, or almost this tendency to find, there's a word for it, homology, no, not homology, it'll come back to me. Probably homology, yeah, that's a word. So this tendency to just pick and go with people that resonate and reflect, you know, oneself and one's own preferences. But it's imperative that in order for Sino-American relations to be repaired, homophily, you're right, exactly, homophily. Gosh, thank you, Bourdieu. Thank you very much. You're not Bourdieu, but you are like Bourdieu to me. You know, there's a huge distinction there, to paraphrase Bourdieu. But you know, because of homophily, we see a persistence of social separation between different communities in both US and China, but also in third-party states as well. So all of these observations and questions bring me on to the final part of my paper today, which is, can education exchanges be a bridge over troubled waters? As Simon and Garfunkel once very famously sang, an elegant song, beautiful song over. And I would say this, you know, Sino-American educational exchanges are vital in and are certainly capable of improving bilateral relations, but to a far more limited extent, and in order for them to be successful, we have to be cognizant of and accept the inherent limitations and the extent to which it can make a difference given an unfavorable or a deteriorating even external environment. And that is because we need to cultivate the interpersonal trust, the personal bonds, the requisite knowledge, and to offer a proof of concept that Sino-American people-to-people exchanges can and must indeed work. And our hope is that these effects will then be amplified in a path-dependent manner by future generations in 20 or 30 years' time. I just came back from an excellent field trip to PKU. I was invited to deliver a talk at Beida in Zhejiang on the impacts of automation on unemployment and the structural injustice of it, as well as the structural injustice in underemployment. So I'd be very happy to do another discussion in the future on that, on education and AI. But just very quickly on the field trip and my thoughts of that, what I came to realize is the attitudes that we often observe in the politicians, especially in American politicians, that they espouse towards China, are not necessarily reflective of the attitudes of the youth and the younger generations. And in fact, another Pew Research poll revealed that roughly 4/5 of Americans have an unfavorable view of China. That's true. But while 70% of Americans, aged 65 or above, have the above view that countering China is a top American priority, only 28% of those aged 18 to 29, I say only in relative terms, share the same attitude. Indeed, President Xi Jinping of China has declared that he wants to welcome 50,000 students back to the mainland, or back to China, including Hong Kong and the mainland, over insert undefined time period, but hopefully the next year or so. So there's several grounds on which I feel fairly optimistic and sanguine about the prospect still of Sino-American exchanges making a difference. And the first of them is their ability in fostering personal relations, putting a face to the name, putting a relationship to the face, and putting friendship and trust into the kind of relationship we cultivate. Schwarzman, Yenching, but also the Nanjing Johns Hopkins joint program, the NYU Shanghai joint program, the Duke Kunshan program, and even Nottingham Ningbo. I mean, these are all initiatives where, frankly, unless you're a social recluse, or you just don't like interacting with the other people on your program, you're bound to make some friends, as a student, as a scholar, who aren't from your own country or your own sort of comfort zone, right? And therefore it is almost like an active challenger to homophily, or the homophiliac tendencies of individuals, so to speak, right? And to me, what would be useful here is to conduct more detailed sociological, qualitative, and also maybe even panel data studies looking at the relationships between Schwarzman and Yenching scholars and mapping, in 20 years' time, these relations onto enduring, interpersonal ties as these folks join their respective governments. That would be a very interesting paper for those of you who are looking to write a paper on successful cadet programs or elite-centered programs in terms of scholarship-based exchanges. So that's one way in which I think bridges matter. Alumni communities, again, the Yale Beijing Center does a lot of work with the Yale community in China, the Stanford Center too, and here in Hong Kong, the Chicago alumni network is very strong, and of course there's a Booth School, which is right next to the HKU campus. The second bridging mechanism is about equipping individuals with the necessary knowledge and the multi-dimensional understanding of the other. It's one thing to learn of China through textbooks. It's another to learn about China through reading foreign affairs articles. I tend to avoid doing that, actually, because I sort of think I've had enough fiction in my everyday life. I want to stick to non-fiction when learning about China, so I tend to, sorry, foreign affairs editors, I really like you. I like you in the same way that I read, as I like Lord of the Rings, and also certain Chinese state-run tabloids, but that's an aside. Anyway, I believe in the importance of equipping individuals with the repertoire and the skill set to navigate the other party, but that can only come through immersive learning. And this is a pedagogical observation, right? So the experts in the room on education, please correct me, but you've got to be immersed in a cultural context in order to understand what the other is like, in order to understand where the other party is coming from. Because short of that, then what you'd be stuck with is essentially textbook, flat, know that propositions as opposed to know-how knowledge. You would not have them alone, the sort of nuances, the subtleties to understand subtexts in cultures, let alone complex normative claims. If you ask someone in America, in rural America, say somewhere in Georgia, or not Georgia, so bad choice of state, say someone in I don't know, let's just say
Iowa?
Iowa, you say, what do you make of Tianxia? Right? Or if you ask someone in rural Shanxi what they made of the Gettysburg Address, because it's not their fault that they haven't had the exposure to the other side. And if anything, I'd actually say a rural Shanxi villager is likelier to know what a Gettysburg Address is than Tianxia is known or likely to be known to the Iowa farmer. That's not through any fault of their own, okay? I don't want to denigrate, this is not a derogatory comment, it's just an observation that if you haven't been there, it doesn't matter how many books you read, you just don't know what it's like. So to me, education exchanges at the very least provide that dosage of realism and a modicum of exposure that equips different parties with an understanding of not just the theory, but also the practice and the praxis of engaging in conversations of how to talk to an American, how to talk to a Chinese. It's hard, I had to learn both actually, because I was very socially awkward, but learning how to interact with others takes time, takes exposure and experience. And that ties me on to the final point, which is the Sino-American ties and education exchange can still act as an effective proof of concept for bilaterally conducive collaboration in areas of convergent interest. That sounds like a mouthful, but it's very straightforward. Pandemics, macroeconomic stability, climate change, more specifically how to deal with the impacts on third parties and third countries under climate change, but also when it comes to AI regulation, limiting the proliferation of dangerous technologies like nuclear weapons. These are all domains in which we need that trust and an understanding of how, not just the what and not just the why, but how, in order to sustain a conducive collaborative relationship between Beijing and Washington and the Chinese and American peoples, who are both great peoples and great civilizations too. And this ties me on to the final point I'm going to make today on the role of Hong Kong in Sino-American relations. So I wrote a piece for the SEMP published on May 15th, 2024, that saying Sino-US youth exchanges are vital and Hong Kong has absolutely a role to play. And that is because I see Hong Kong's role as platforming and hosting important conversations on key subjects of possible convergence, but also of disagreements. It's not just about figuring out solutions to all the problems I talked about just then, and it's not just about finding common ground in them. It's also about allowing for China and the US and representatives from both sides, especially amongst the youth, the academics and scholars, to hash out their differences. What we often neglect in calls for more dialogue is there seems to be this sort of Pollyannish, Panglossian assumption that all dialogues must be harmonious. But as it turns out, most countries don't have exclusively harmonious dialogues. In fact, most countries on earth don't have that, right? So what this is to say is that we can achieve genuine solidarity and equanimity only through allowing for our divergences to be hashed out. Right? It is good that people are criticizing America here in Hong Kong, as long as you can also criticize China in a constructive manner. There should be room and space for reasonable criticism of both sides, as opposed to kind of mouth-frothing nationalism and jingoism we often see from select commentators in a mainland or over the US or on the US, or indeed a hysterical China, anti-China crowd that we often see in the US lambasting a straw man. So it is imperative that Hong Kong serves as a site for deep, comprehensive, constructive and balanced conversations that may be critical, may be constructive, may be positive, may also be negative and realistic on Sino-American relations. But a key prerequisites for Hong Kong to be able to perform that role, and this is sort of really the final messages I want to end my presentation on, is as follows. Firstly, Hong Kong must dial down on the unduly ultra-nationalistic rhetoric that engages in little more than just smearmongering and smearing of any country and all countries out there, including the US, but also other states out there. How could we have conducive conversations in a city where you have folks saying, America is a tyranny, down with the American imperialists, or alternatively, folks saying, pretty unnuanced, uncharitable, and just emotionally charged and offensive things about China. I mean, as a part of China, we need to respect that. We need to acknowledge that we are a part of China, as opposed to trying to engage in discourses that unduly transgress upon the baselines of our own country. And yet concurrently, we would benefit from avoiding and eschewing this sort of, jingoistic, chauvinistic rhetoric that only, it's almost like you're watching the first episode of The Three-Body Problem, and you think, oh, that's cute, right? But it's not cute, it's scary. So my recommendation is we need to pull back on the nationalism and re-inject our public discourse with more open-mindedness and compassion. The second recommendation is we really ought to highlight and preserve the differences between Hong Kong and the mainland when it comes to education and academic freedom, and allow for a celebration of the virtues of the Hong Kong model, as opposed to just, parroting or praising uncritically and unquestioningly the sort of virtues of the mainland model, which, mind you, there are many. There are many dimensions and elements in how Beida and Tsinghua, just run the education and campuses and the campus life that I find fascinating. It's amazing how, in many ways respectful, how openly cordial, and how sincere the students are vis-a-vis their academics. They genuinely care about the teachers' opinions, not because they are the teachers, but because they see them as sources of knowledge, sources of wisdom. And that kind of sort of almost Confucian dynamic between 老师 and 学生, it's somehow sometimes hard to find here in Hong Kong. I don't know if the both of you would agree with me on that front. So there's a lot that Hong Kong could learn from the mainland, but that Hong Kong could also offer the mainland when it comes to the different ways we go about in doing education and academic engagements, and also foreign exchanges. And finally, my recommendation for any and all folks who are listening in a Zoom, I hope there's at least still one person on a Zoom, but if not, it's okay. I really hope that we can develop known niches and areas of expertise that the mainland and the US both struggle with, that would additionally offer, China and also the US a new space, a new platform for exploring bilateral engagement. So take a very concrete matter, that I'm working on right now as an example, which is AI alignment between human beings and AI. I'm not sure how many of you here are aware of sort of the paperclip experiment that Nick Bostrom set forth, but essentially, what happens if AI is trained in a way that develops highly divergent preferences in practice that diverge from our interests as humanity? Okay, say you tell an AI, preserve world peace, and the AI goes around shooting everyone who dares protest. Because after all, if there's no one protesting disturbing the peace, then maybe it is all peaceful. Now that is a logic that is very dangerous. Unfortunately, most governments around the world don't think like that. But it is imperative that we figure out ways of regulating and training AI such that AI alignment with human interests can be accomplished despite the intensifying geopolitical rivalry and competition between China and the US. And Hong Kong certainly has a role to play, given our relatively open, actually very open access to information, open borders in terms of movement, entry and exit, and of course the fact that you can access, at least till this very day, Google, Facebook, YouTube, without using a VPN. This is amazing. These are all cherished merits that Beijing appreciates, Washington should appreciate, and Hong Kongers must learn to appreciate and champion again, unabashedly, unreservedly, and openly, in order to make our Hong Kong our home, a city that can serve, as opposed to be hampered by and purely affected by, in a passive way, the Sino-American relationship. So I'll close there, and I welcome any and all questions, both online and offline. Thank you very much.
Before I thank our speaker, he opened the space for me, and I should mention this. I was also at Peking University recently, and I was welcomed very warmly in a symposium about China-U.S. relations, but also relations with other European and Asian countries on this question of higher education and geopolitics. So I just wanted to mention that. And before, again, thanking you, we do have a discussant who's been very quiet. And let me just say something about our discussant. The reason he's here too, which I think is a great reason, is because he was a professor at Harvard University teaching students in international education. So he had students from different parts of the world. Maybe a similar experience that Courtney had. So I'd like to, but at the same time, because I don't want to forget this, I'm not the dean of the Faculty of Education, but if I were, I would invite Brian to be an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Education, because really we have to pull you in. The discipline of education, and if you want to argue whether it's a discipline or not, is really surrounded by sociological, political, economic forces. So to have you here, you're bringing all that out, and we need more of that. So I really, elect me as dean, and now let me turn it over to Kaiming, please. Kaiming.
I hope your argument just then hasn't tanked your chances of becoming dean thanks to the speech today, which goes against and rails against your case. But anyway, thank you so much. Thank you,
so much
Thank you.
immersed in your talk, and I have so many things to say, so I will use about 3 hours. No.
We have the time. We have the time.
I'll stick to 1 or 2 points. But first of all, I appreciate very much Brian. He's so young. He's not even half my age, you see. And he's so knowledgeable.
Really?
And he knits things together so beautifully.
Yes.
And I'm glad he's in philosophy. That means he can do anything. Yes. But I will start with your last point. I think in terms of academic research, it could be evaluative. Of course, this is not our job now. It could be descriptive, which is to understand more, and also prescriptive. In this case, prescription means fortune telling, and I don't think I can tell fortune. So I can only concentrate on what you said. To go to the extreme, I think the world is very complicated, and the best thing for Hong Kong to become, among others, education, finance, and so on and so forth, should be a hub of spies. That will be welcomed by all countries. Given that you know there are spies, you can't kill them. They are all there. But the best place is like the first scene in Star Wars. Remember the Star Wars? You have all kinds of features, creatures, and that is
Not the Soviet Union, US Star Wars, right?
No, the film. Right? I think there are still spies in Hong Kong. You want to purify Hong Kong, and there's those spies, and nobody will pay attention to it. Right? Now I'm not. The national security people who against me say, no, of course, they can say so. Right? I think this is reality. What I'm trying to say is what we are facing is the Pope Benedict, in the beginning of the year, made a kind of a speech, right? You have some
New Year's address.
Don't mistake, we are now facing the Third World War. I think he's right.
Don't mistake.
Don't make a mistake.
Don't make mistakes. We are now facing the Third World War. I think it's the Third World War, right? Except that it's not only guns and the battleships. It's more comprehensive. More comprehensive. Is on all fronts. So I will not elaborate. You are all intellectual enough to understand this. But what is happening is also in the US in particular is also what we Chinese experienced, not in Hong Kong, in the 60s and 70s, a cultural revolution. Everything is governed by ideology. Right? I can tell you, since you go to the history. Once I read from the literature, I found it. Is it true? Sun Yat-sen, before he passed away, I think it's 1921, 22, and he made a speech saying that the examination system in China is the earliest and the best. Right? At that time, there are no schools yet. It's about civil examination, clergy. Then I look up and he said the civil service system in the world is due to China. I thought it was kind of is it true? So I look up the literature in the UK. There was a leader in the East Indian Company, which is overriding all the economy in India. In Canton, in his office in Canton, found that this is a very good system, the civil examination. And he wrote a petition to the parliament. But the parliament's first reaction was, no, this is China. This is Chinese. Right? This is more or less like what you have now. Anything about China is wrong.
Yes.
Or is mediocre. But he tried to practice the same thing, test the same thing in Guangdong and Canton at that time. And then I think it's about 40, 50 years later, it became the British adoption of the first civil service law. Before that, all the civil service, the clerks in the parliament were sent by the nobles to get insider stories, to manipulate and so on and so forth. So it was indeed. Now I'm not trying to exaggerate, but what I want to say is it's not a kind of a superiority of China. No, not at all. It's that the world is interconnected. You can't tell which one comes from which, right? Some will say spaghetti comes from China's noodle. Some will say China's noodle comes from spaghetti. I think
What do you say?
it's time.
Let's have a poll.
But comes back to your point, I think students, academics are basically innocent. What are facing all this political pressure, complexity, are manipulated by a few politicians. Politicians don't mind so much what would actually happen to education. Used to be is a human capital that we pay, but nowadays, because in Hong Kong we have the opportunity to travel to all countries, and during the pandemic you have all kinds of Zoom meetings. I don't think any education system in the world now is comfortable with its own system. I don't think so. But the other thing is that I don't think any government is comfortable enough or able enough to handle education issues. It's no longer on their agenda. No longer on agenda. Look at any country. We have a team in Hong Kong visiting Finland. I thought that was a kind of almost a fairy tale about education. No, what I heard was against that. I'm not going against Finland, but I'm saying that it's universal. Education facing, this is my area, but I won't elaborate. Education is passing its time. Our education system now emerged as a whole nation system, emerged in 1870 in the Elementary Education Act in the UK. That was the beginning. And all countries are system, manpower, human resources, right? And I'm going to finish very soon. And what I'm trying to say is understanding. I don't think politicians' understanding is on politicians' agenda. They don't mind. It's not rational. But we academics have the mission to understand. But understanding, as you said, because I teach that, requires a kind of a cultural perspective. You understand that different countries, different nations, different groups have different basic assumptions about things. I'll end by one example. My younger brother was engaged in a training for people who are in the Foreign Affairs Office in China, young. And he said, the first thing I tell them is, what is law? It's quite different. In China, they say, 发扬优良传统. That is, how do you translate?
Disseminating our terrific traditions.
Yeah, terrific traditions.
Sharing the fruits of our traditions.
And this is written in the law, China's law. But he said, once it's in the law, in a common law, you have to define. What do you mean by tradition? This is difficult. What do you mean by incredible tradition? What do you mean by dissemination of tradition? All these require definitions. But then in China, it's taken for granted. Because granted, in the foreign affairs announcements, they always say that we have to go the correct way. What is correct? What is correct?
Yes.
Right? So I think cross-cultural understanding is so important, and this is perhaps what we can do in Hong Kong, because we are facing different cultures. We know cultural differences better than any other country. Right? When you live in one country, people in one culture never understand its own culture. There's a cultural elements in any society is not challenged in the same culture.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kaiming. Thank you.
Thank you for an extremely incisive, analytical discussion today. It's one of the best that I've heard in this period of U.S.-China tensions and what we need to think about in terms of higher education. I haven't heard anything except, we need to continue to have students coming back and forth. We need to, get the Fulbright program back and so on. But I think we need deeper thinking on it. And today you've brought in many points.
And Hong Kong really should aim, sorry for jumping in, Hong Kong really should aim to play a part and a role in the 50,000 student pledge from President Xi Jinping. We should aim to attract 5,000 students to Hong Kong, and that would already be 10% of the national output and objective. I mean, for all the talk of Hong Kong's playing a role in 融入国家发展大局, I agree. So 国家的那个教育走出去, our education, export and import strategy, we need to play a role. We can find a role. So I hope whoever's listening or not listening, we can play a role in helping our country engage the world. 这个就是我们的责任. So that's our responsibility.
Let me have a suggestion. Maybe Ugo can play a role. Could we actually organize similar discussions, at least across the different departments in the university and across society systems, right? With goodwill. It's not debate. It's about understanding each other. And that's the only thing we can do. Because we are not biased. Okay. Yeah, please.
Again, we've gone a little bit over time. I want to thank everyone here in the audience and everyone online. And we hope that this is the one of several talks by Brian over the next few years, because this problem is we're going to be dealing with this challenge for quite a while. And again, thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you, Gerard. So, thank you very much. Thank you.